Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. On this day, remember to send flowers to your software teams, perhaps with a note. AppSec is dead, shift left is new. Writing secure code takes collaboration with you. Which means this week we talk with Doug Kersten about setting up programs to help developers make sure they're building software in a secure manner and prepared for the inevitability of vulns. In the news segment, a reflection on last year's top web hacks, a collection of Google's top vuln rewards, an inspection of AirTags, an AI detection, biometric deception, and more. Think of a rhyme and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Contrast Security enables organizations to secure their applications from development to production. By embedding security sensors within software, Contrast automatically and continuously detects vulnerabilities in both custom and open source code while developers write code, providing them with context-specific how-to-fix guidance for easy and fast remediation. At the same time, by identifying only true vulnerabilities that pose risk and eliminating those that do not, Contrast empowers developers and security teams to prioritize and focus on only those vulnerabilities that matter. Learn how Contrast can help you secure your applications from development through production at securityweekly.com/contrast.
This is episode 184, recorded February 14th, 2022. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
I am talking to you from the far distant future of 2022. Wait, no, that's this year.
Yeah. I think, okay, episode 184, February 14th, 2022. Yeah, well, my numbers are all off today. Who knows what's going on? The other things that are going on is that the call for papers is now open for InfoSec World 2022, featuring expert insights, enlightening keynotes, and an interactive breakout sessions. Eventually, I'll read that this year's conference will take place on September 26th through 28th in Orlando. We're looking for experts and innovators to contribute their ideas, experiences, and perspectives to help shape the 2022 program. To submit your proposal, please visit securityweekly.com/ISW 2022. Plus, don't miss any of your favorite Security Weekly content. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe on any of our podcast feeds and have all new episodes downloaded right to your phone and straight to your ears. You can also join our mailing list, Discord server to chat with us live, and follow us on social media and our streaming platforms. Doug Kersten is CISO at Appfire. He is an industry veteran and strategic, tactical, and hands-on leader who has been instrumental in instilling a positive security culture within fast-paced organizations. He brings more than 2 decades of security leadership experience to his role, having led IT and security programs for some of the world's top financial institutions and law firms. Doug is helping Appfire continue to lead the way in cloud security for the Atlassian ecosystem and software developer community at large. Hello, Doug. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, great to be here. Thank you.
We're happy to have you here because this is our chance, especially for a CISO joining us, time to talk about how programs are made not for people, but of people, and security programs, and especially too, I mentioned security culture, I think at the beginning, and security culture in your bio there, and that's one of the things you're creating. So that's kind of the teaser for what we're building towards. But to kick things off, you've come in many times to build up security programs. So what are some of the things it takes just to get started thinking about, walking into the void where there's no security or no culture of security that exists, and we need one? Sure.
So a lot of times you walk into organizations and they have security. They think about security. They work on security. They have programs that they kind of started or that they're progressing through, but the overall objective and goal of that organization is not really tied to security. And so at Appfire, one of the things that they've done is come in to say, hey, we want to enhance our program. We want to make it better. We want to improve it. We want to make security one of the core pillars of what we do. So that's kind of the first thing you're looking for. You're looking for an organization that's really committed to that. It's difficult to make an organization to commit to that if their leaders are not already committed to that. So if you're walking into a new organization, that's one of the things you need to figure out. Is that organization, just from a fundamental standpoint of accepting that security is a program and not a project or a requirement, that they kind of bought into that. Now, walking into an organization, you're never going to come into a clean organization where everybody believes that. So part of becoming and building a security culture is kind of bringing those people into the fold. And a lot of that has to do with counteracting what may be a negative view of security to begin with, and also the view that security is a policing function and it's there to make your job more difficult and increase friction and cause all kinds of problems for you and give you more work. So one of the things I like to do when I go into an organization is, first of all, let everybody know that everybody is responsible for security. And some people haven't even heard that concept before. Everyone is responsible for security. Everybody needs to think about security, but also that security is a partner. We're not a policing function, we're a partner. And part of being a partner means that, you have to have two sides of the coin. You have to do things as a responsible person in a security program, but information security has their own responsibilities, and you can't have a partnership without two sides contributing to it. So really coming in, it's about building that mindset that it's in a partnership, not a policing event. And then once you can build that view of a partnership, then you can start doing a lot of interesting things. You can get a lot of people bought into what you're doing. You can reduce the fear that security is coming into an environment to push back and say you're doing something wrong and you're going to get in trouble because you did something wrong. And once you realize that that's not really the case, you get a lot of buy-in. And that's where it gets really interesting, because then you start finding out about things you never knew about in that organization, and things that, and even sometimes solutions that you never even thought about, in that environment. So it's really kind of critical to kind of get that first step and build those relationships to make that happen.
Yeah, avoiding surprises absolutely sounds like one of those strategies that security should be trying to, that's one of the things they should be trying to optimize for. And we've talked a lot about, you're talking about building relationships. We've done the same in the sense of at the AppSec level, talking to developers. I'm kind of curious too, as you were talking about building relationships, you're talking about going out and discovering where are those surprises. What does that look like from your perspective? How are you building relationships with either developers themselves or IT or legal, for that matter? How does it, what are the differences from your perspective to be able to say that there is actual leadership buy-in here?
Yeah, so one of the things, especially in the last few years, it's interesting you bring up legal, because one of the interesting things is all the changes going on and all the regulatory requirements, and it gets more and more prescriptive over time. It gets more and more difficult. You really have to be tied to the hip with the legal team and the general counsel, and they have to buy into what you're doing. And you also end up supporting them in their privacy obligations as well. So we kind of tied together at the hip. So building a really strong relationship with legal, I found to be very productive. But I also, I walk in, I spend my first 30 to 60 days, no matter where I'm at, and I just talk to people, whether it's the CEO or the COO, all the way down to the individual developers. I'm having conversations with all of them to say, what are your security pain points? How can I help you? Identify quick wins. But the idea is to, start to build those relationships. And I try to, listen to them, understand what their pain points are, and see if I can take on and remediate some issues as quickly as possible within the first 90 days. So you get those big wins within the first 90 days. You reduce the overhead and impact that security has on people. Then it makes life a lot better. So one of the things that you do is, you come in and, security questionnaires from customers. This is always a big thing. And you find out that, the head of, your head of your engineering team, and he's got a couple people answering security questions instead of doing development work. And you walk in, and it's a very common issue. And you say, I'm going to take all that off your hands. And then, the idea is that you should be developing and not answering security questionnaires. I'm going to take that off your hands. So building kind of those initial components where you can start taking work off of people and making their jobs more efficient and making them more productive and let them do the things that they like to do is a big part of those relationships. But ultimately, when I'm talking engineering, engineers, I don't want to necessarily walk up to them and kind of wiggle my finger in their face and say, you got to do this. And what I'd rather do, and what I do, is I integrate solutions into their own workflows. So I think if you have a Sev1 issue, I want you to treat security the same way as you treat any other Sev1 issue. And so kind of building into those processes and workflows allows me to understand what those processes and workflows are, but also allows the engineer to more effectively address them, right? So that comes back to it's a partnership, not a policing relationship, right? So what I like to do is kind of plug into all the processes that the engineers plug into. And then by doing that, I can kind of roll security into their environment without hopefully being hugely impactful and getting feedback through that. So,
yeah, I think to me, one of the things that appeals, especially from what you're saying, is that, handling Sev1 issues like other engineering Sev1 issues, probably one of the biggest negative impacts, or probably one of the biggest feelings of policing and or comes from vulnerabilities. And what you were describing was not the case of all Sevs are created equal, but security vulnerabilities are more equal than others. So I'm kind of curious, especially too, as you're if you're deploying more tools to identify defects, but they're dropping into the developer's pipeline, that's a good aspect. But potentially you're also now just creating more work, creating more vulns. So what are some ways just to help ease that collaboration, ease the introduction of these tools that potentially are making more work and are not necessarily going to be immediately welcome?
Yeah, so you can't walk into an organization and assume that they're going to address your security vulnerabilities and drop everything else that they're doing.
Right.
That's not realistic, right? I have to walk in and set my expectation that, we're going to take on some risk for a period of time until we address these concerns. But we're going to take it on in a fair way using their processes. So they may be able to only dedicate 10% of their time to fixing vulnerabilities. So I need to identify those vulnerabilities, which to me are the most important. From a security perspective, and let them identify themselves ultimately what those are, so that they can start working on those things. The other side of the coin is that the expectation isn't that, if you have a security vulnerability that, Log4j is a good example. You have a security vulnerability, people are attacking that vulnerability. Well, that then becomes a different story because it becomes, more impactful. You have to have a slightly different process to deal with that. And but you're still plugging into those severity 1, 2, 3, 4. You're still plugging into that, but there is a bit more prioritization involved around those use cases. But in general, you're talking about let's prioritize it, but let's understand the risk, because if you are not tracking your vulnerabilities, so if I bought a new system and it identifies 1,000 vulnerabilities, okay, I'm better off today than I was yesterday, because yesterday I had no clue how many vulnerabilities I had. And let's say 10% of them are critical and 15% are high and 40% are medium. That's kind of usually that kind of long tail feeling when you're doing this stuff. Well, let's attack those criticals and then those securities and then again, plug it into that system and expect that, hey, it's going to take time to get there. And then while they're doing that, you're doing alternative things in the background. You're looking at, do I have a WAF? Is it set up correctly? How am I protecting that environment while they're taking care of that technical debt? So it's a multi-pronged approach. It's not just laying everything on the engineer and saying, you got to fix this, or we're going to have big problems and it's going to be your fault. You can't really look at it that way. You have to go through that layered and build that layered security model, and that ultimately will give people time. You want to give people time. You want to give them runway. That's why you get funding from VCs. You get runway, right? So the same thing with security tech debt. You want runway. So you build up your program to allow for runway. And so that's kind of how I address it and how I work to do that. So, and then also, a lot of times engineers will say, well, I can fix this problem. But I go back and say, well, I can fix it better because I can do it at the network level. And so don't worry about that problem. So there's kind of that give and take as well.
That's interesting, and a lot of that seems to come from you. You are fortunately in your position able to also influence budget, headcount, et cetera, to shape a strategy around fixing those issues, whether they're at the network level so you can scale better, or they're giving the runway as you described, setting up WAFs or other protections as the tech debt gets erased. But I'm curious, I don't know if maybe tech debt ever gets erased, and here I'm kind of leaning towards that idea of security culture. And maybe the question around this to set it up is, you've got a 30-day plan, a 60, 90-day plan, I'm sure. What do you look towards to say that you are succeeding or that you're feeling good about the plan, that you can, also set up a program and then either at some other point in time be able to walk away and point to, this was success, this was effective, this other thing was effective?
Yeah. So it's kind of funny. I don't know if it's funny, but there's a lot of security.
Let's find out.
Out there, and I go to the security, and I know some people see value in those and some don't. But I use them as an initial baseline and say, hey, how do we look to the world? And then I can use that as an initial baseline. And then internally, you start looking at, to your point, there's so many vulnerabilities coming in now. You could knock out 50,000 vulnerabilities and 52 come in. So how do you know if you're getting better? How do you know if you're improving? So it really revolves around how you create your vulnerability management program. One of the things I've had success with is instead of patching by asset, for example, this server has 1,000 vulnerabilities. Let's take care of this server. I patch by what I call solutions, and so when I patch by solutions, I'm looking at where am I going to get the biggest bang for my buck, right? If I can do one patch and it increases the security, improves the security on 1,000 assets, I'm going to do that. And the thing about that is, you actually get better buy-in with that because, and you get more consistency because you're doing it all at the same time. And because it's impacting so many systems, and in a positive way, you get a lot of buy-in from the teams doing that work because they're like, wow, I can have a big impact by just doing this one thing. And it's not about being perfect. Nobody's ever going to be perfect, right? It's just not possible. It's really about being better than the other guy. And I know that kind of sounds awful, but if you're a little bit better than the other guy, you're much less likely to be attacked successfully, or even attacked at all, if they see you have these controls in place. In the past, I've even published incident response policies and IT security policies publicly, just so those potential malicious attackers can look at us and say, "Wait a minute, maybe I want to go hit an easier target." So it's kind of it's a mix of the technology and the PR/mind games, that you have to play to stop yourself from being attacked. It's not just a purely technical issue, right? You have to think about it more from a public relations and even marketing standpoint and visibility, so that you become less likely to be a target. And so that gives you more runway as well. It all comes back to that layering. That is another piece of the pie that reduces your likelihood of being attacked and successfully attacked. So.
Yeah, and there's absolutely a theme there of transparency. And I think you were alluding to that earlier when you're talking about SEVs, for example, that, treat the security SEVs like engineering SEVs, but let's just understand what's out there, and publishing policies, exposing policies, externally. That's a pretty impressive step for transparency. I'm curious, your background, mentioned coming out of IT. Was coming out, how did coming out of IT influence that? Would there be something that you would point to for others to learn from, have insights on, to say these are lessons learned about what are good ways to set up security programs or interact with security in a successful manner?
Yeah. So when I first came into the security field, I came from the IT world, and I started out swapping out backup tapes and grew to administration and project management, product management, some coding work, all kinds of stuff. And so I was doing all kinds of stuff, and I thought I was great at it. I was like, I'm good at this. Then I went into the security world, and I was like, oh, wait a minute, I'm missing this whole silo of work. I'm missing this whole piece that I'm not even thinking about. And as I was working to set up policy and requirements around information security, I talked to the functionally like CIO of the company, and he said to me, well, Doug, you were doing all these things and you didn't do all this stuff. Why do I have to do all this stuff? And so I was like, well, I had to admit I wasn't doing a good job, and it wasn't fun, but I essentially admitted I wasn't doing a good job. I should have been doing these things, and I wasn't. I couldn't really give him any other answer than that because it was the truth, And so, when you're thinking about your role as an engineer, and that's kind of what this topic is about, when you're thinking about your role as an engineer, you have to really look at it and say, am I really doing everything an engineer should be doing? Am I really thinking about security? Am I really prioritizing security fairly? And it goes back to prioritizing fairly. Am I really doing that? Because if I'm not, I'm probably not doing my job well. And in my mind, if you're an engineer, that's a part of your job. It's not an add-on. It's not an extra feature. It's not something I like to have. It's part of your job. And if you don't think that way, I think your future is, you're going to have troubles in the future, because the way these regulations are coming out now and how prescriptive they're becoming, it's going to be harder and harder for companies just to take independent actions on their own and say, I'm secure. A good example is GDPR. And GDPR was one of the first times outside of like the banking industry where they said, you have to report within 72 hours to the regulatory authority if you have an incident that impacts personal data. That's the first time they told you when you had to set, first of all, they never really told you had to tell anyone. And second of all, they didn't give you any timelines and tell you when. So it's 72 hours after you identify an incident, right? Become very prescriptive, right? In the past, you could notify anytime or not notify at all, and it was really up to you, or not even have an incident response program. It was really up to you. So that's an example. Another example is under GDPR, you do your penetration test and you're like, well, that's confidential information. I don't want anyone to know that, because if somebody knows that, they know where my vulnerabilities are. But under GDPR, they say that, if your customer asks for your penetration test reports, you have to give it to them. Not the final attestation letters and things like that. You have to give them the actual report with the details of your vulnerabilities. Now, you can argue whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, because, giving away your vulnerabilities is never a good thing. But that's what the regulations say, right? So, and as an engineer, you have to start thinking about that, because as the regulations get more prescriptive, they're going to be delving more into your area of expertise. And it's going to be more difficult for you to succeed if you don't do those things.
I think you said something interesting there. I may interject. I think you said something interesting there, was you sort of led into the part of that story from a point of view of, the security you versus the system in you, if I can give you those two hats. Sure. And I think that's something we've seen across quite a few folks out there. From a security person point of view, I don't think I think we need to pay, would you agree with that we need to pay a little more attention and compassion to the amount of work that we're throwing over defense to the engineers? Of like, it might seem like something simple to the security folks saying, oh, you just need to, as you said, 10% of your 1,000 issues. But frequently for the poor guy who's actually doing the engineering on that, does that seem like a fair load? Or how do you go about, with your teams actually sort of, I'll say caressing or finessing to actually get that the goal is still met, but not without giving the guys on the other side of the fence sort of a fire hose?
Sure. So it comes back to that prioritization, and you're absolutely right. The level of and effort that people put in, administrators and project managers, all these people have to put in to just meet the business need is intense. And it comes back to being treated. So it's a two-way street. Like I said, it's being treated fairly. So if I'm asking them to do something for me and they want me to do something for them, I have to be just as proactive. If I have to be, it's like, what's that saying, do unto others as you want them to do unto you, right? If I want somebody to do something for me, then I have to be just as proactive back with them. But you have to always go back to that understanding that they may not be able to take on all that workload at once. And part of that for me as a CISO, I go back to the CIO and say, listen, you don't have enough people to do the work here. I can support you. I can either, one of the things I've successfully done in the past is embed security resources within corporate IT and production side of the house to support them in those efforts, right? Because you can't do it without the people resources. It just doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. So if I can embed a resource, they report to me, but they sit with that team every day, and they're in their change review boards, and they're in their go no-goes and all those other things, and they're supporting them directly, you get a lot more buy-in. And, they see you as supporting them by providing resources rather than just demanding that work be done. And I found that to be extremely successful. I've tried things like liaisons, where you build relationships in other parts of the organizations and hope that they'll support you. And a lot of times what happens is, you talk to the individual contributor and you'll say, oh, I need you to prioritize this. And like, yeah, I'll do it. They're very excited. I'll do it. And then their manager or director comes in and says, no, this is your priority. And so they don't even come back to you and say, yeah, I'm not going to work on your stuff now because I've been given priority by my manager. They stop doing it, right? Mm-hmm. And to be fair to them, that's I would do the same thing, right? So it's really about, building the relationships, being treated fairly, do unto others, be that partner, but also support with resources wherever you can, and that's a big part of it. So.
It's interesting to hear that too, that there's an aspect of, and coming to a question, bear with me, there's an aspect here that you're describing very much of security doing engineering or assisting with engineering, as opposed to just being governance. In other words, saying, here's what our obligations are under GDPR, or this is what we need to do to hit an ISO 27001 certification by the end of the year, those types of things. How has that balance changed between security as an org being engineering, security as an org being governance? Is there something that you can point to about either early on in a program, the bias is maybe more towards engineering, less towards governance, or is it just really subjective to each individual organization that you enter?
My experience is that it's been focused on engineering, security engineering, but those engineers are usually focused within a particular part of the organization. So they're focused specifically on product or some piece of a product, or they're focused with some specific area in the DevOps environment or the hosting environment. They may be just part of the hosting environment where they're focusing on a particular thing within the hosting environment. So you get a lot of inbred specialists, and that's usually what I see when I'm coming in, is that you have security people, you don't really realize it. You have security people, there's people that are really interested in it, but they're touching on individual solutions instead of a program, right? They're touching on individual pieces of the environment, and so that's kind of where I see people hire the engineers first. In fact, most I've done some research, my own research. I don't count this as being perfect, right? I've done some research where, most companies don't hire their first security person until they're about 100 to 150 employees. Prior to that, it's just individuals that are interested in it taking it on. And then their first security employee is usually an engineer. And they are usually solving to very specific problems, like on the developing side of the house. And the other parts of the infrastructure and the operations and all those things get kind of ignored. And then when you get closer to 200, 250, that's when you start hiring your first security leader. So you're walking in. Now, one of the big changes over the last 5 years is the governance risk compliance piece. That's become huge. My last organization, my GRC team, was the biggest team out of all the teams. It's just that interaction with the regulators, the auditors, the customers, the vendors, all those different pieces of work that are not necessarily technical, but that are there and that are required. That I've seen like phenomenal growth in those areas. But security engineering, I think, is the first place. Bringing, or security architects, sometimes you'll see those. That's kind of where most companies start.
No, I think, and that's. It's always nice to hear like references about growth too, like the 100, 150 people. When does the first security hire happen? What is that evolution? And I'm just trying to think of different ways to think about, as you are building up a program. Also want to touch on, we did mention security culture. Now, I'm not going to try and say we need to have some great semantic definitions about DevOps or DevSecOps or security program versus security culture, what that means. But I think you were kind of getting to a lot of these aspects. But let me just ask it more of a question this way, is there a meaningful difference when you're describing, here's what we're setting up as a security program, here's what we're setting up as a security culture?
That's a great question. Yeah. So security, you can have a security program without security culture, right? You can't have security culture without a security program. That's how I view it, right? So security culture is everybody buying into the need to be responsible for security within an organization. And that's everything from the administrative assistant to the facilities person to the engineers to the leadership, everybody ultimately buying into owning and being responsible for security. But if you say, okay, I'm responsible for security, but you don't have that program to support you, it's not really a security culture, right? You can have a program with no buy-in and you're constantly struggling to make things happen and you're constantly trying to make things go the right way. And it's so much more difficult without the security culture. But you can't really have security culture without the program. So you really have to tie the two together. And my mission statements, I kind of come and bring and pull kind of a mission statement together, and it always ties in security culture to the security program. Just because I think in a longer term, you're going to be much more successful, and you're going to have buy-in and you're going to have the ability for your program to operate without you, right? Because that's the other thing. If something happens to me or I want to go on vacation, I want that program to work. And if everybody's bought into the security culture and working with that mindset, then it's much easier to support the security program itself, right?
No, absolutely. Yeah, I think so. And it's come around from, I think, just the kind of things that we haven't mentioned, just to sort of reinforce. We haven't said, here is building the program around a tool, and I think the reason you haven't said that is because that's not the smart way to go. And maybe that's really obvious, but maybe it's one of those things worth mentioning.
Yeah.
And the other thing about, go ahead.
Yeah, I totally agree. You can't build a program around the tool. In fact, I go the other way. I said it's execution framework, strategy, people, process, systems, metrics. You start out with your strategy, then you hire good people, and they build up your processes, and then you build your metrics out of your tools to see how well you're doing. But you notice that tools is pretty far down that chain, right? So that's kind of, you don't really walk out. So I'm going to build my program, so I'm going to buy this fancy tool set, and that's what it's going to be based on. It doesn't work because every organization is different. Every product is different. Everything, what you're selling is different, or not selling if you're not nonprofit is different. So you can't go in there and say this one tool fits all. You really have to go in and do strategy, people, process, understand those things, and then say, okay, I'm going to bring in these systems and tools to fit that process. So that's how I look at it. I look at it more from the top down than to me, the tools, if you look at it from a tools perspective, it's bottom up.
So now, one other question I've got too. We've been talking very much about setting up a security program. What becomes different in terms of, let's say, you've done this a couple times, I believe, set up a program. When you leave, are there different skill sets or different approaches to maintain or grow and expand the program? What are some different, I imagine there might be different skills or might be different things, metrics, measures of success between establishing and maintaining or growing. What would those look like?
Yeah, you're talking about from a metric standpoint?
Yeah.
Yeah, so in the beginning, you work on relatively basic metrics. You're like, how many security tickets do I have? First of all, I may not even have a security ticketing system. How many do I have? If you're talking about an ISO speak, how many nonconformities do I have? And am I getting better? Am I closing them out? How many risks have I identified, and how are those risk treatment plans being executed against? But over time, you can get more and more complex. Like how many security events did I have? Is another example. You get more and more complex over time, and you can build in stronger and stronger metrics. So incident management is probably a good thing. How many security events do I have? Not only how many security events did I have, but how long did the analysis phase take? If I have an actual incident, how long does the containment, eradication, recovery, and follow-up? How long do each of those steps take? And am I getting better or am I getting worse? So even having a basic set of metrics is valuable. Because now you can do things, and I'm going back to like the CISO thinking, is that now you can go back there and say, okay, well, we just closed 100 tickets in the last week, and we have one guy, and he has to do all these other things too. Now I could take that information and say, listen, we're completing 100 tickets a week. We're getting in 150 a week. This is not going to work. Our numbers are trending down, or trending up. We're going to have a problem here. So even really, really basic metrics help you out. But as you get more sophisticated, as your solution set gets more sophisticated, you start having a much better understanding of, you're kind of focused on the big problems, and then let you narrow down to the smaller problems. So it's how many vulnerabilities do you have? Are they going down every month, or are they not? How many new ones are coming in? How long does it take somebody? Then you cut out down even smaller. Well, how long does it take somebody to actually solve for a specific vulnerability? What percentage of vulnerabilities, security vulnerabilities, are there to general vulnerability? General feature set requirements or bug fixes. Starting to break those metrics out to give you a clear and clear picture, and you can actually find additional problems within with what you're doing, and you can come to find them. So, like I say, even a basic metrics is extremely helpful. It gives you.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Oh, sorry, Alexa's doing that.
Can you repeat your question?
No, Alexa. But so that's the idea. Even a basic metric is worthwhile.
This might answer your question.
Alexa, stop. Sorry.
We've all got questions.
I gotta answer that. Should let it go on.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to back up a tiny bit here, and I'm curious to hear the viewpoint from this from a CISO. We frequently have either practitioners or maybe consultants, or sort of a little more closer boots to ground on here on ASW. But from your point of view, we spent the last half hour thinking about how do we build up the security program, how do we do all these type of things, the culture, and I think at some point it almost sounded like you said the cult, but close enough. But from just give us a minute or two your thought process about the last 6 months or a year, where at least that's when it's been popular, of the quote, the relatively new problem of how do we actually keep track of what software is being used, what libraries we're importing, what all those dependencies are within our software. I was just looking at one of our reports for our next segment, the Veracode Year in Security. If I remember right, I think it was 97% of Java applications are using some sort of open source library. I mean, the stuff's out there, but the question for you is, from your sort of point up on the wall, how do you keep track of what dependencies are out there, what new dependencies are coming in, and sort of navigating that minefield? Anything you've sort of what's worked for you, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, so this is where tools do matter, right? Because there's no way you can track all those vulnerabilities and even determine if you have those in your environment. So tools matter here. So you have to take your tools, and look at them again with a layered approach. So using tools like Veracode or Sneak or something like that to do your source code analysis and help you identify those vulnerabilities early on as you're developing and building product is extremely important. And again, tying it back to the workflows that are there is extremely important. I think one of the greatest successes I had is we walked in, and the first thing we did was say, okay, let's get the severities on the same footing. Let's be treated fairly. Great, that worked. And so we had weekly meetings where we would go over the security vulnerabilities and say, okay, is this severity right? Because we had to build a severity model that worked with security vulnerabilities as well. Is it right? And that worked well for a while, but then we realized we had to start pushing that left. That the volume that was there and the complexity that was there, it was not possible for a team to meet once a week and discuss severity. So what we ultimately ended up doing is pushing that role to the left. So now the engineers will identify that vulnerability, verify the severity, and put it into their workflow based off of those rules. And then when you're talking about, so there's that piece of it, there's coding securely and developing securely, right? So you have that piece of it. But then to your point, you have the library issue, especially open source libraries, and how do you handle that? Fundamentally, you have to start, you have to do that inventory first. You have to understand what you're using. You have to set, there's that legal side of it. So even sometimes you have to set up what kind of open source licenses you're allowed to use to not run afoul of intellectual property issues. But then there's also the SCA kind of tools that let you identify, I'm using this vulnerable library that's out of date and I need to remediate against that. So the first time you go through this stuff, you can't just turn it all on. If you turn it all on, everything falls apart.
You can, but yeah.
You can, but everything falls apart and everybody hates you. So the first thing you do is turn it on to monitor, and then it's kind of honor system to kind of remediate and do the things you need to do. But ultimately, you get to a point where you say, well, if you don't fix this problem, you can't contribute, and so we were very successful not only in addressing the security vulnerabilities we were introducing, but also in addressing the library issues where we set up specific rules on major, minor versions and what you were allowed to use in the production environment and what you weren't, and how long you had to remediate a problem between a major and a minor version. Now, I don't remember the specifics. I'd have to go back and look it up. But we gave a framework that everybody could work within to address those concerns, right? And then also push that left. So it became a part of the CI/CD pipeline. And as they're trying to push code, if they failed, ultimately, once we got past that monitoring phase and that honor system phase, they couldn't submit code. It was part of their performance, job performance was tied to that. And that's why I think in the very beginning, we talked about if you're an engineer and you're developing without taking security into consideration, your career path is going to be relatively short. You really have to do it. And so building that into your process, and we talked about it before, you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be better than the other guy. The only kind that place that philosophy doesn't work is if you have an APT kind of attack. But if I have an APT kind of attack and say I have $1 million a year budget, and they have multi-millions, or they're a government and they have billions, you're probably not gonna succeed in that way. You have to. That's where you got to roll back to your incident response plan and things like that to address those kind of things. But it really comes down to you have to get into a place where it meets the risk tolerance of the organization you're at. And some organizations could say, hey, security libraries, libraries in general have to be updated within 30 days of this vulnerability being identified. But other companies could be, 3 months or 6 months, and they're totally fine with that risk level. So everything I'm talking about has to ultimately flow back into the risk that the organization is willing to take on. And that depends a lot on the leadership and the business period.
Unfortunately, we depend a lot on our time limits. And speaking of major and minor numbers, you've given us a major amount of information about setting up security programs, building relationships in the minor amount of time that we've given you. But it was a great conversation, Doug. I want to say thank you for joining us.
Great as well. Thank you.
Also want to thank John and all of our listeners. We're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.